I got a 36 on the ACT, and over the last 6 years, I've helped thousands of students to reach their dream scores on this test as well. Now in this video, I'm going to show you why even if you're a bad test taker, you can still hack the ACT and get to your dream score as well. Just like my student Ava, who was a 4.0 student but couldn't get past a 22 on the ACT until we hacked this test together, and then she ended up with a 30. So we're going to go over the 3 steps for mastering the ACT even if you think that you're a bad test taker, and by the end of this video, you're going to be right on your way to mastering the ACT. So first things first, what you need to understand is that the tests you take in your high school classroom are just not at all the same as the standardized tests that you need to pass in order to get into great schools. And that's why a lot of students who do very well in class don't end up doing well in these standardized tests, because they're not testing the same things. So you might be wondering, how are these standardized tests different than normal tests? Well, the ACT tests 2 different things. They test content and they test strategy. And basically, if you haven't heard me talk about content and strategy before, content is what you know and strategy is how well you can show what you do know. And actually, both of these things are tested differently than what you might see in high school. A lot of people might think, oh, the content's got to be the same, right? It's the same grammar rules, it's the same algebra rules, but that's not actually the case. There's differences in both the content and the strategy. So we'll want to cover exactly where both of these things differ between standardized tests and your high school classes. So first things first, we'll want to cover the content differences between your high school classroom and the ACT. Content underlies everything that goes on the ACT. There are no quick tricks or quick hacks or quick strategies that you can use to get around a content deficiency. So if we don't have a strong content base, then we're not going to pass the ACT no matter how well we do on all the other things that I mentioned. And the main difference between content on the ACT and content in your high school classroom is that on your high school tests, your teacher's typically only going to test you on 1 chapter at a time, whereas the ACT covers everything that you've possibly learned in the first 2 or 3 years of your high school classroom. Obviously, when you're only tested on 1 chapter at a time, there's only a couple things that you could possibly need to know for each test. And also your teacher in your high school class most likely gives you a review guide that covers all of these things and tells you exactly how that teacher is going to test those questions. The exact question types that they're going to show up, and maybe they change the numbers, they change the word order a little bit on those question types, but it's very, very simple to get by without really ingraining that knowledge in your mind. And this is a completely normal and fine way to learn different concepts in high school. But we also have to realize that most of the time, this type of learning is going to be very temporary and it's not going to stick around with us for the long term. If we're only studying a review guide right before the test, and then we take the test, then that knowledge is probably going to be out of our brain in the next 48 to 72 hours. And it's definitely not going to stay with us a couple years later when we have to take the ACT. And this is the most common problem that I see with great students but bad test takers. It's this short-term memory where they did great, they got an A or an A+ in their geometry class, but all of a sudden when we get to a question on the ACT that's asking about the area of a circle, we have absolutely no idea how to solve that question. So you're probably thinking, well, that's great. Does it mean that I have to completely relearn everything from the first 3 years or first 2 years of high school? And the answer is absolutely not. You do not need to relearn everything from your first 2 or 3 years of high school classes. That would be a huge waste of time, especially if you have somewhat decent fundamentals, which most great high school students already have. They have decent fundamentals. There are just a lot of the little details that we're missing out on or that we just don't necessarily remember since it's been so long since we've learned some of these different concepts. And more importantly, we also have to know that the ACT does not test every single concept that shows up in the first 2 or 3 years of your high school classes. Really, they only have a couple of different concepts that they just ask about again and again and again. So we don't need to go relearn every single niche algebra rule in order to pass all of the algebra questions on the ACT. What we need to do is actually just target the specific content areas that the ACT tests frequently and that you actually don't remember. So it has to be both of those things. If it's something that you don't remember, but the ACT doesn't test it, good, we don't need to worry about it. And if it's something that the ACT does test a lot, but you do remember it, then good. I mean, we don't need to remember that or relearn any of that stuff either. It's only where there's the overlap between it's one of the concepts that the ACT tests all the time, and it's also one of the concepts that you happen to forget from your high school classes. That's where we really want to focus all of our time. And now the way that I think is best for doing this is starting off your preparation by taking a full-length diagnostic test to see exactly where all of your strengths and all of your weaknesses are. Then you want to go in depth, figure out exactly what types of questions you're missing, and figure out all the content that you didn't know. If you didn't know the right triangle formulas, or you didn't know the area of a circle, or you didn't know what an independent clause was, so you missed some questions there, then those are all the content areas that we would have to study for as we're preparing for the ACT. And of course, this is where we also want to prioritize the highest priority to the lowest priority. And this is what I do with all of my students is after they take their first diagnostic test, I go in and I figure out exactly what all of their highest priority areas are, and then we focus specifically on those highest priority areas. That's exactly what you're going to want to do as well to pass these standardized tests. And then what we need to do is take those high priority areas and actually learn all of the concepts that we're deficient in. So this looks like using your free resources, or if you're working with a tutor, you're working in my program, you would work with all the resources that we have, and you would go through and learn exactly what you need to in order to start getting those questions correct. And you don't want to just be spoon-fed that information. You have to learn it originally, but once you learn it and you take some notes on the new concept that you just learned or relearned, then what you want to do is practice on similar question types. So you don't just want to be spoon-fed the information and then try and think that you learned from that. What you need to do is work on those specific question types again and again without your notes and without any outside resources, so that you can prove that you're actually learning that material, and you want to see yourself actually getting those questions correct without any extra help. This is actually going to be somewhat similar to your teacher giving you a review guide that looks exactly like the test, as long as you're using real ACT practice questions. The only difference is we actually want to retain that information over a longer period of time. So we want to ingrain that a little bit more than just our normal high school review. And so that pretty much covers how we approach the content on the ACT. Now, the next reason why, even if you're a great student, you might be struggling on the ACT is that you're lacking some of the strategy. So this is reason number 2. We covered content. Now we have second reason, which is strategy. And this strategy part of it is something that's probably unfamiliar to you if you've only done high school tests before, because the ACT requires you to know a lot of strategy, but most high school classes have absolutely no strategy to them. There's never been a need to learn this strategy before. When you're taking a high school test, you're not worried about taking different sections of the test and worried about different subjects all showing up on the same exact thing. So that's the first thing. All you do is, in high school, you just focus on one thing at a time. You focus on one chapter of one subject. On the ACT, you have to worry about 4 different subjects and all of the different concepts that might be covered within there. So a lot of different chapters contained within each one of these subjects. And the second thing within the strategy bucket is the timing aspect of it. Rarely does a high school class ever really crunch you on time. Typically, your teacher doesn't want to press you too much on time, so we never really have to worry about the strategy of kind of flying through answers very quickly in order to get all the questions done. Whereas the ACT is notorious for being the test that nobody can finish on time. So if you've never worked quickly through a test before in high school, then that's definitely going to be an area that you're going to have to work on going into the ACT. And the way that we fix your strategy is that we have to come up with an individual, personalized strategy that works specifically for you. And this has to be done for both each section of the test and each type of question within each section of the test. So I know that might be a little bit overwhelming and vague. So let me break down exactly what I mean by that. We have to come up with a strategy for each section of the test first. So this looks like knowing exactly what you're shooting for on the math section, so you know how to approach it. If you are shooting for a 33 or a 34 on the math section, then what we need to do is answer the first 30 questions of the test in about 20 or 22 minutes. Because the questions get harder as you move through the math section, we want to capitalize on the earlier questions and basically build up a lot of extra time for us to spend on those more difficult questions at the end. But that's only if you're shooting for a really top score in the 30s or mid 30s. If you're only shooting for a score in the 20s, like maybe mid 20s, maybe even a little bit, it gets borderline when you're in the upper 20s. But if you're shooting for a score in the mid 20s on the math section, then all we need to do is really lock in on those first 30, 35, or maybe 40 questions. And we can almost entirely ignore the last 20 questions, because those are the harder questions that we just don't necessarily need to put that much time and effort into. Because if we do very, very well on those first 35 or 40 questions, we can just actually completely guess on the last 20 or 25 and still end up with that mid to even sometimes upper 20 score on that test. So this is where we need to have an overarching strategy for each section of the test. That was just one example on the math section. that fits your specific situation and plays to your strengths and helps to hide your weaknesses. But that's not the only thing that we need to know with strategy. Strategy also involves knowing how to approach each question type in a way that makes sense for you and allows you to find the correct answer. So for example, on the science section, what I see a lot is students struggling with what I call yes, yes, no, no questions. These are the types of questions where among the 4 answer choices, there are 2 that say yes, and then 2 that say no, and then each one has different reasonings for either that yes or that no. So again, the strategy will be dependent on how each individual processes the question, but on this specific question type, what I typically find is that students can actually save a lot of time by using the answer choices that they give us to our advantage. So if they're giving us the reasons why the answer is either yes or it's no, then we only need to look at what that reasoning says. We don't need to dig through the entire science passage in order to try and figure out what they're asking about, because the reasoning is given to us directly in the answer choices. And one of those 2 reasonings will be correct. So now we can narrow our focus from the get-go and only look at 2 things instead of looking at the entire science passage. Once we find which reasoning is correct, then we can cross off 2 of the answer choices and then see whether the reasoning that's correct either backs up yes or backs up no as the correct answer choice. And a lot of times this can save students tons of time on the science section. But that's just one example of one type of question and the best strategy to approach that question type. What you would want to do in order to master all strategy is come up with a strategy to approach each section of the test, like I said, and then also identify your highest priority question types that you're missing. And if you're not missing those questions because of content, then you want to come up with a different strategy for approaching those types of questions and kind of tinker around and play around with different approaches until you find one that works for you. And now that covers all the reasons why students who are great in class might not do too well on the strategy of the ACT. But now we have the 3rd and final reason why great students in high school might not be that great in the testing center. And that is factors outside of the test questions themselves. So we've covered all the content and the strategy, which are everything to do with the test questions. Now we have the outside factors as well. Now this would look like anything that impacts our focus and our ability to actually think clearly on test day. So obviously the fact that the test is on Saturday morning at 8 a.m., we might be tired after maybe a long night, Friday night, hanging out with friends or something like that. Even if we're well rested, the fact that this is a 3-hour exam also plays into that. When we're used to taking 45 to like 50 or maybe 60-minute tests, that's like 3 or 4 times as long as the normal test. So all of these outside factors are making this test just very different than your typical high school test. And that's why there might be some difference between your grades in class and your score on the ACT. So coming from an athletic background, this is something that all sports have always said, you need to practice like you play. And professional athletes are always trying to simulate their game environment as much as possible. They're not just going through the motions during practice. I'm sure there are a million quotes about practicing like you play and making the most out of your practice, making it simulate the game as much as possible. We need to do the exact same thing on the ACT so that everything that we've trained for is second nature when it comes to game day or test day. And the first thing you need to do is build up your mental stamina by working with full-length ACT practice tests every once in a while. We cannot just only work through practice sections of the test and then all of a sudden try and piece all 4 sections together on test day into a 3-hour test. So we need to start building that stamina up just like we would in any other endurance sport by taking practice over time to build ourselves up to being able to focus for that full 3 hours. And as you're doing this, you want to simulate the test conditions as much as possible. We need to be doing completely focused practice tests. We should not be taking these tests like during your lunch break or during your study hall when there's other people walking around and you're kind of half in a conversation with someone and you're also trying to eat lunch at the same time. No, like these practice tests need to be sitting down at your desk or sitting down in the library or wherever you focus best and taking it nonstop for 3 hours. You don't want to break these up into smaller sections or be distracted while you're taking these tests. And obviously, these have to be real ACT tests. They cannot just be random questions that you found online that kind of somewhat simulate practice tests. No, these questions need to be coming from real ACT tests ideally that they've administered recently in the past. Another big thing on these tests is we want to actually use the ACT bubble sheet as well. A lot of people don't really realize it, but when they're just circling the answers on the test, they're actually saving themselves a lot of time by not having to also go to the bubble sheet and fill in whatever bubble it is that they're answering with. Now, a way that you can actually see just how big of an impact this has is get one of those bubble sheets, print it out, and just fill in all the bubbles without even caring about, without even doing anything else. Just go in and fill in A for every single answer and see how long that takes you. On the English section, when you have to do it 75 times, a lot of times that can take 5 or maybe even 6 or 7 minutes on its own. So you don't realize the impact that bubbling in the answer sheet actually takes, but it does actually add a significant amount of time. So again, if you don't do that on your practice, and by the time you get to the real thing on test day, you're going to be 6 or 7 minutes behind on the English section because you didn't practice bubbling your answers in. And now once we've simulated our testing environment as much as possible throughout our practice, we also want to focus on the other couple small factors that impact our focus on test day. And this includes sleeping well. This is another massive thing. There's nothing that impacts your ability to focus more than having a consistent and reliable sleep schedule in the week leading up to the test. If you're not getting enough sleep and you're just trying to catch up on sleep the night before the test, you're not going to be nearly as focused as you would be if you just got your good 8 or 9 hours every single day for the few days leading up to the test. Studies have shown this time and time again that you cannot expect to perform as well if you're underslept versus someone who is properly slept. And this is not just the day before the test. This needs to be ideally the entire week leading up to the test if we want to maximize our focus. And the next thing that might also be impacting your focus is the breakfast and the snacks that you eat on the day of the test. If you're eating a sugary cereal or a donut for breakfast, then you're not going to be able to focus nearly as much for the duration of 3 hours that the test actually takes compared to somebody who eats a good healthy breakfast like eggs, oatmeal, maybe a PB&J or something along those lines. If you're eating a lot of processed sugars during your breakfast, you're going to have a blood sugar spike and a subsequent blood sugar crash during the test, and that's going to leave you with a lot less focus. So understand what you're eating and how that typically impacts your focus. And also, this is stuff that you can experiment with as you're taking your practice tests. Experiment with different breakfasts and see how it impacts you. If you really doubt the fact that donuts impact you negatively, then take a practice test with donuts beforehand and then take another practice test with a good breakfast beforehand. You'll see just how much it impacts you when you do that. So there you have the 3 main reasons why you might be struggling on the ACT, even if you're a great high school student. You've got content, which is again the most important thing, and it underlies all of the other aspects of the ACT. You've got strategy, and you've got the environmental factors and the last things we talked about there as well. Now, trying to fix all of those different things sounds really complicated, and you want me to work with you hands-on on the ACT, including everything from analyzing your weaknesses to giving you the content knowledge and the targeted practice that you need, and crafting strategies that work specifically for you, and also making sure that we're as focused as possible on test day. Then go ahead and check out the link below this video where you can apply to book a call where we'll see if it's a good fit to work together. Other than that, keep enjoying all the free information that I've been putting out here on YouTube, and also check out the Instagram where there's a lot more information as well. And stay tuned for more on ACT, college scholarships, and college admissions in the future.